have a prepaid call from Jelly Exotic.
Tiger King, I was on and off that for 5 years. It evolved from a very different project where each episode was going to be about a different species. And you can kind of see what happened once we met Joe and we met Carol Baskin, and these characters were like off the charts. I'm not sure how much it would have gotten noticed if it hadn't been for COVID. I mean, I'm sure people would have seen it, but it wasn't a...
Maybe not the cultural phenomenon.
No, certainly not. No, the memes would not have happened.
Doug Abel, thanks for hanging out with me today. How are you doing?
AJ, I've never been better.
Good, good. I'd say thanks for inviting me over, but I sort of invited myself over today.
It's called chutzpah.
Yes, yes.
So you need that.
So can we start just with you kind of introducing yourself, your title, and list off, a few of your favorite projects that you've worked on?
Sure. So my name is Doug Abel. I'm a film editor. I've been doing it since the 1990s. I grew up in New York City, based there for a long time, and gosh, projects. I think one of my first notable projects was the Dana Carvey Show.
This is just such a weird feeling. It's we're putting on a show that hasn't been seen in prime time in many years. It's going to be what Johnny Carson would say, a little irreverent, a little wild. That
was sort of an ill-fated but fun show to work on that unfortunately was on right after Full House, and it had very edgy humor, so this particularly edgy comedy show didn't carry well from that audience. But that was a project where I met a lot of comedians and made really great connections on that particular project. I met Steve Colbert, Steve Carell, Louis C.K. was on that show, Robert Smigel, who you might know as the guy who does Triumph, the insult comic dog. For me to poop on! That guy. So it was a kind of a quick burst, 8 episodes. I don't think the 8th episode ever aired. And then the plug got pulled, but met a lot of great people on that, and that led to some other great jobs.
So I've got your IMDb pulled up here, dating back to '92. I'm just gonna sort of rattle off some of the shows that I recognize from on here. The Nickelodeon classic Pete and Pete.
Good morning, gut buckets. Time to wipe the crud from your eye sockets and bite the wind of another Wednesday.
Strangers with Candy.
Just remember, the first day of school is the most important day of your whole life. If it doesn't go right, there's no way to get it back.
Metallica, Some Kind of Monster.
All the other drinking and all the other junk that I was stuck in, it was so predictable.
One of my all-time favorite sitcoms, 30 Rock.
Little Kenneth Allen Parcell from Stone Mountain, Georgia. Growing up in your mama's tract house, dreaming of working on a TV show, dreaming of making it all the way to the NBC.
And of course, the infamous Tiger King.
Before you hear it on the news, I'm going to tell you myself. About an hour ago, we had an incident where one of the employees stuck their arm through the cage and a tiger tore her arm off. I can give you your money back, or I can give you a rain check.
Just in hearing those titles, or maybe some I didn't mention, what have been some of the projects that have meant the most to you?
Yeah. Well, 30 Rock was definitely a high point. It was a big network show, ridiculous talent, amazing guest stars. And, I had a really important job, and I was able to work with Robert Carlock, the producer, and Tina was pretty well involved. I mean, she was quite busy also, but she would definitely come in, at least once a week or whatever to look at cuts.
So would you interact with Tina?
Yeah, I mean, typically we'd have a little screening with just a few people in the room, 3 or 4 people in the room, and ideally she was there if she could, because she was one of the producers, and it sort of depended. But Robert Carlock was the other big producer, and he would be in there a lot.
Yeah, I noticed your resume is pretty heavy on the comedy. Was that an intentional thing? Were you wanting to get into comedy, or that's just sort of what happened for you?
I mean, I think I veer towards that. I think I enjoy it. I was a big fan of SCTV and SNL growing up, and I think I'm kind of a funny guy. That's your job as an editor, is to find the funniest take. And if there isn't one, figure out a way in the editing that maybe it could be funny. But in New York City, so you did have the presence of Comedy Central, but also there were tons of documentaries. I mean, New York is really like Mecca for documentaries. Boston is also a really important town, and that was kind of it. But out of necessity, out of need to keep working, I did documentaries as well. The Fog of War, which came out in 2003, I think.
We saw Vietnam as an element of the Cold War, not what they saw it as, a civil war.
was a documentary about Robert McNamara, and that ended up winning the Oscar for Best Documentary that year. And so I got to go to like the New York Film Festival and these massive screenings, and it was at Cannes Film Festival. So that was also a real high point, is to go from, you know, this project that I thought we started before 9/11. And I just thought, it's this old guy with a gravelly voice, and, you know, why do I care about what he is reminiscing about the war? And then 9/11 happened, and then all of a sudden our country was at war, and everything he was talking about became much more relevant and became a really important, documentary to be out at that time.
In other news, the international adult conspiracy has struck again.
Dating back to '95, Pete and Pete show.
It was a
on the
great
Disney
show.
Channel.
Oh my God. Yeah, it was a show about these two brothers, and it was shot on 16 millimeter with kids. But what was great about that show is they had all these funny guest stars. So you might have Iggy Pop played one of the kids' dads, and they had Michael Stipe played an ice cream man, I think. They had Adam West from Batman played the principal. Every indie director who was in the New York City area did one of those episodes, because it was a good gig, you know, and it was a great way to get your beak wet in the film business, is to do one of these low-budget kids shows.
So I imagine it's a pretty different process editing a scripted comedy like 30 Rock versus a documentary like Fog of War. Starting with the scripted comedy, are you pretty much just editing from a script, or are you able to kind of put in your input in the edit as well?
Yeah, I mean, your job as the editor, unless you get a note from set like, oh, this thing bombed, or this actor couldn't get this line, you pretty much go by the script. Of course, on a comedy show like 30 Rock, they're improvising, especially at the end of the scene. They almost always will just like keep going. You certainly have leeway to add more than is in the script, but they do want, the writers, you know, the writer's kind of king, and they do want to see their words you know, out there. They were ruthless in terms of, you know, just keep it moving. And
such a fast show.
It is really fast. Alec Baldwin is a guy who does these sort of methodical readings and very slow, and he would like whisper them a bit. So I remember having to like work with that quite a bit to try to like sometimes pace him up a little bit. It was a very clever dynamic. You know, just Tina Fey's character being kind of one of the boys, and, you know, being a slob and into, you know, junky food, and just, I don't know, there was just something very endearing about that character.
And hey, who knows? Maybe some people won't be coming back next year.
So things do go awry, but assuming they don't, you know, you pretty much go by the script. Ask the director or the producers if you have a brilliant idea for something, and they might say go for it. Or you have an alternate version. I do that a lot. I'll say, like, the slate at the beginning will say, you know, here's this director's cut, extra scenes at end, you know, and I'll put up a little slate, it's like alternate version of this scene where the guy doesn't get a pie in his face or whatever. It was me and another editor named Ken Luto, and I did work on the pilot, so I sort of feel like I got to set it in motion. I mean, obviously it was someone else's vision, but I got to help be part of that team that kind of set it in motion, and I feel like, I don't need to do more of these, you know?
On the flip side, with like an unscripted documentary, are you playing more of a producer role and pulling scenes together, or do you have like a rough script that you're editing from?
I mean, there's no rules with documentaries, but the rule seems to be, back in the day when you were shooting on film, and film was incredibly precious, and you could basically just shoot for 10 minutes at a time, and then you had to stop and change the film reel. There was a lot of discipline and a lot of like planning out. Around the early 2000s, when video cameras were good enough to kind of use, there was an expression we editors called spray and pray, which is basically just film everything. Metallica, some kind of monster, had 1,600 hours. Just film everything because it's just tape, who cares? The editors will figure it out. You're often just taking the material and just looking at it and saying, well, if I had to make a scene out of this, what would I do? So you don't necessarily know what you're doing as you're doing it, but you're like, well, this is kind of interesting. Here's Lars of Metallica messing around with a drum beat, and he just can't get it right, and he gets all frustrated, and then his kid comes in and he kisses his kid, you know? And so like that's just just a nice little nugget of a scene that probably won't get used, but maybe. And so you start to develop those, and I don't know if you can see on the screen behind me here, but typically I use a piece of software called Miro. It's sort of a virtual index card program, and you can sit there and like, kind of move the scenes around, and you know, I usually have an orphans pile. These are scenes that we don't have a spot for, and then I usually have like a must-use sound bites column that'll be like, man, we got to find a place to put this. This is hilarious, or this little scene is hilarious. We've got to find it, but we don't actually know where in the structure it can go yet. So that's a valuable tool in terms of like, how do you corral all this material? It's typical for a documentary to go on for a year or more. I mean, Tiger King, I was on and off that for 5 years. At the time, the producer of that lived in Woodstock, New York, and I lived in Woodstock, New York, and my wife and I had started a sanctuary for rescued farm animals. And so I was kind of known in town as like the animal guy, you know. And so she approached me, she knows a film editor, and she approached me originally about that project. It evolved from a very different project where each episode was going to be about a different species. And you can kind of see what happened once we met Joe and we met Carol Baskin, and these characters were like off the charts. I'm not sure how much it would have gotten noticed if it hadn't been for COVID. I mean, I'm sure people would have seen it, but it wasn't a...
Maybe not the cultural phenomenon.
No, certainly not. No, the memes would not have happened, the endless memes.
So at what point did you guys come across Joe Exotic?
This is my first album, I Saw Tiger, and this is my second album, Starstruck.
They had filmed him, I want to say in like 2016, and then I believe he got arrested in 2018.
I am never gonna financially recover from this.
A lot of the film was made when he was in jail. He had an extensive archive. Like the guy filmed had people follow him around for his own show. So there's a show within the show, which is the Joe Exotic show that he would produce, his little web show. And he kept all that on hard drives. And so he licensed that to the project. I mean, they paid him a lump sum for the rights for it. And it gave us thousands of hours of stuff. So we were able to kind of keep him alive, even though he was in jail for a lot of it.
So was Joe in jail when he licensed the footage to you all?
Yes. Yes, he was.
That's really funny.
So the current project I'm working on, it's about the production of the musical Godspell that took place in 1972. It originated in New York in 1971 and was such a hit that it spread all over the world. And so they needed to hire these young folks. And there was a guy named Marty Short who was going to school with Eugene Levy and Dave Thomas. And they kind of all knew each other, and they all tried out for this show. And there were some folks like Gilda Radner and Paul Schaefer, Andrea Martin, were all kind of in the area and all sort of converged on this show. You know, there's no recording of it. So we're having to tell the story of this amazing production that ran for a year and a half, and we have no real footage of it. And so we're just using interviews, and we do have stills, and they're just telling hilarious stories. It's really about a family, because these guys are, many of them are still really dear, dear friends. It's being executive produced by Judd Apatow. We are going to be using animation to fill in a lot of the holes, and that's been kind of fun. Real kind of like cartoon style, like almost like Yellow Submarine, Hanna-Barbera, you know, early 70s, actual hand-drawn animation. There's a company in New York that's doing it. And so that's fun because you can kind of do anything, right? You can draw whatever you want. So I've been just coming up with silly gags. There's one part where Eugene and Marty actually shack up together at Eugene's apartment because Marty can't afford a place yet. And so I wrote like, oh, it should be like The Odd Couple, like where like Eugene's real messy and Marty's real neat. And actually they play those roles in college, in a college production of The Odd Couple. But you can also do stuff like, there's this character standing here and then all of a sudden the background changes, you know, and you can show that like Marty went from, you know, performing for himself in his attic, singing Frank Sinatra songs. Then all of a sudden he's on the Royal Alex, which is the biggest theater in Canada. And you can say, well, the animation can like show that, you know, basically anything I want, you know, I can think of in my head.
In closing, do you have any advice to editors that are just starting this career?
Yeah.
You know, you growing up in New York, do you think it's crucial for someone to start out in New York, California, to get involved in the type of projects that you do? Or I'm sure it looks a lot different today than when you started, but do you have any advice at all?
I mean, those are still the nerve centers, really. New York and LA, and then like second tier Boston, San Francisco, and Atlanta, Chicago to a certain extent. Certainly getting started, it does help to be in those cities. But in terms of learning the craft though, I really think you can do that anywhere. I mean, when I was you know, when I was a kid learning how to make films, I mean, we literally used crap like this. And it took forever and was expensive as heck. And you can really do it with you just need a laptop and a phone. And you're good to go. And the way you learn is by doing. And if you do want to do something that's more of like a scripted, narrative style thing, you're going to quickly learn, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're like, oh crap, I shot it from the wrong side. It looks like he's looking, looks like I'm talking to AJ over here when AJ's over there. By making those mistakes, you say, I'm not going to make that one again.
Well, Doug, you've been super gracious with your time today. Thank you for sharing your story with us.
Absolutely. Godspeed. Godspell.